A rancher came begging for milk, and the Chinese woman breastfed the baby and became the mother he needed. The sky was a sheet of iron, heavy and gray. Winter had seized the Wyoming territory, and a blizzard was clawing at the plains, promising a cold that could freeze a man's soul. Inside a modest log cabin nestled near Coyote Creek, My Lin huddled by the hearth, feeding scraps of wood into a struggling fire. The wind howled through the chinks in the logs like a hungry wolf. She wore a thick wool coat, a gift from her late husband, over her simple tunic and trousers, her hands chapped and raw from a morning spent breaking ice at the well. She had just coaxed a fragile flame from a pine knot when the knock came. Faint at first, then frantic, desperate, and swallowed by the wind. My Lin stilled. Another knock, harder this time, a fist against the wood. She reached for the heavy iron poker resting by the fire, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Then a voice, broken and pleading, cut through the gale. "Please, to milk is my son. He's dying." She froze. Slowly, her fear giving way to a different instinct, she slid the heavy bar from the door. There on her small porch stood a tall rancher, shoulders broad and hunched against the storm, his hat and coat caked in snow. In his arms, wrapped in a thick but inadequate horse blanket, was a baby, its breath a shallow frost in the air, its mouth blue and cracked. My Lin's gaze locked on the infant. She could see the faint outline of ribs even through the swaddling. Without a word, she stepped forward. "Give him to me." The rancher, Jackson Croft, hesitated, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and distrust. "I have milk," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He will die out here." With a solemn, defeated look, he passed the child to her. He did it so gently, it broke her heart. My Lin brought the baby inside and sat in the rocking chair by the fire. She unbuttoned her tunic, pulled her blouse aside, and guided the baby's mouth to her breast. The child's lips fumbled weakly, then, with a shuddering gasp, latched on. She exhaled, a shaky, relieved breath. The warmth of the infant's body against her skin was a shock, a memory of a life she thought was lost forever. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the baby began to suckle, a weak but determined rhythm. The rancher remained by the door, snow melting in puddles around his boots, unmoving. The firelight flickered over the deep lines of fatigue etched into his face, over a raw scrape on his cheekbone where the wind had whipped him with ice. "You saved him," he whispered, his voice raw. "You saved us." My Lin didn't answer. She simply cradled the child closer, rocking ever so slightly as the blizzard raged outside. The baby's tiny hands twitched against her. "What is his name?" she asked softly. "Thomas," he replied. His mother, she never got to say it much. My Lin nodded, her own heart clenching with a familiar ache. Behind them, a gust of wind slammed the shutter closed, plunging the room into a deeper quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of a child nursing. That night, Jackson slowly unfastened a small, worn silver locket from a leather cord around his neck. It was tarnished and plain, but he held it out to her with a reverence that spoke of its value. "This was his mother's," he said. "It's meant to protect the heart." My Lin looked at it, then at him. "I did not do this for payment." He nodded once, his gaze unwavering. "Still," he said, "it belongs here now." She took it carefully, its cold metal warming quickly in her palm, and set it on the mantelpiece beside the fire. The child had stopped crying. His breathing was steadier, deeper. My Lin looked at Jackson, then down at the boy against her chest. "I do not know what this means," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said quietly. "But he is breathing," and in that silence, the sharp lines of distrust and grief softened, if only for a moment. In the flickering glow of the hearth, a rancher and a widow sat quietly beside the same flame, and the sound of a child feeding filled the spaces where fear had lived. 1 week later, the days were short and brutal, the world buried under a thick blanket of snow. My Lin marked time now, not by the sun, which was a pale disk in a white sky, but by the sound of boots crunching through the snow just after dawn. Each morning Jackson Croft appeared, wrapped in his heavy coat, carrying the child My Lin had begun to call an, a name from her own tongue meaning peace. He never stepped inside unless invited, standing on the porch as the wind whipped around him. But the baby's cries had softened to whimpers. His skin was no longer pale with cold. His small hands began to reach for her when he saw her face. My Lin would open her arms, and the child would melt against her as if he had always belonged there. "You named him," Jackson said quietly one morning, watching as she fed the boy by the fire. "I had to call him something," she replied, brushing the baby's soft brown hair with her fingertips. "And means peace. That feels right, does it not?" Jackson's eyes did not meet hers, but he gave the smallest of nods. Later that morning, My Lin set a pot of rice porridge and salted pork simmering over the fire, adding shavings of dried ginger to ward off the cold. She steamed small, savory buns she had learned to make from her mother. When Jackson came back to collect them that afternoon, she wrapped 2 of the warm buns in cloth and handed them to him. "For the journey," she said. He hesitated. "You do not owe me more if I do not give out of debt," she replied. "I give because he is hungry." "And so are you." He took them with a quiet nod, his eyes flickering toward the boy, now curled in a makeshift cradle she had lined with her own winter quilts. That night, long after the fire had burned low and the child slept deeply, My Lin stood by the frosted window, sipping the last of her jasmine tea. The moon was a silver coin in the frozen sky. Her eyes scanned the darkness, expecting only the shapes of snow-laden pines. But there, beneath the twisted silhouette of a cottonwood, stood Jackson, a silent, unmoving guardian. She did not light a lamp. She did not call out to him. But her breath caught in her throat, not with fear but with something else. Protection. Presence. The next morning, after Jackson had taken and vanished into the snow-covered hills, My Lin went to stoke the fire. When she returned to the cradle, a small object sat beside it. She picked it up carefully. It was a tiny songbird, no longer than her thumb, carved from dark pine wood. Its wings were outstretched as if in mid-flight, its form elegant and free. She turned it over. On the underside, carved with a careful hand, were the words, "So he will know he is freed." My Lin pressed a hand to her chest. The child stirred in the cradle, gurgling softly. Later that evening, when Jackson returned, My Lin met him at the door. "You made this," she said, holding up the bird. "Yes," he said simply. "It is beautiful. It is for a rancher's son," he answered. "The bird sees everything, flies anywhere. My son must know that, even if he grows up between these 4 walls." And My Lin looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "You can come in," she said softly. He hesitated, then for the first time, he crossed the threshold fully. He sat on the floor near the hearth while she cradled the baby. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, a warm and living thing against the deep cold outside. My Lin glanced at him, then back to "And you are not what they say," she murmured, thinking of the harsh whispers in town about the solitary rancher. "I am what this land made me," Jackson replied. "But I have never hurt an innocent soul." "Not once," she nodded. "I believe you." Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. Inside, a flame flickered in more than just the hearth. Trust had taken root, not in grand words, but in small, silent things. A bowl of hot porridge, a carved bird, a man who stood in darkness not to threaten but to guard, and a woman who was beginning to understand that her home had grown not only warmer, but fuller. The fire had burned low. Outside, the wind scratched along the walls of the cabin like an animal trying to get in. Inside, My Lin stirred the coals with the iron poker, watching them pulse red, then dim again. Jackson sat across from her, knees bent, hands resting loosely over them, and slept soundly in the cradle between them, one small hand clutched around the carved bird. My Lin broke the silence first. "He had his father's eyes," she said, her voice barely rising above the wind. "My husband, Wei. He worked on the railroad. A blizzard came, much like this one. He never returned." Jackson said nothing, but his gaze never left her. "I waited for 3 days. I kept a lamp in the window and the fire burning, hoping he would see the light and find his way home." She looked into the flames. He did not. The silence grew long again, filled only by the wind and the fire. "My wife passed 3 months ago," Jackson added, his voice low. "The fever came after the birthing. She held Thomas for less than a day. Said she couldn't stay in a world so cold without him. He slowly reached into a pouch at his waist and drew out something wrapped in deerskin. He handed it to her without a word. My Lin unfolded the cloth. Inside was a square of rough linen. At the center, embroidered in golden thread, was a sun with long, spindly rays. The stitches were imperfect but careful, done by a loving hand. My wife, Mary, Jackson said. She made this for our son's naming day. He never received it. She was gone before the ground froze. Of My Lin held the cloth as if it were made of glass. In her family, Jackson continued, the sun means hope. A promise that light always returns, no matter how long the winter. My Lin swallowed hard. And now you carry the sun. Jackson's jaw tensed. Sometimes I think I carry only shadow. She reached across the cradle, her fingers brushing his lightly. You brought him to me, she said. That was light. He looked down at their hands, then back at the sleeping boy. I feared you would turn us away. I feared I had no more to give. The fire cracked, spitting sparks. They sat like that, two people bent by loss but not broken. Not anymore. My Lin folded the cloth again carefully and tucked it into a small wooden box on her mantel. I will keep it safe, she whispered. I promise. Jackson nodded. Then, as the wind howled beyond the walls, My Lin leaned her head back against the wooden beam behind her. Jackson shifted, placing another log into the fire. They did not speak again that night. They did not need to. Some silences carried the weight of whole lives. And in the stillness between them, something fragile but strong began to take root. Something that could not be named yet, but was beginning to feel like healing. Word traveled fast in Coyote Creek, even through the snow. By the fourth day, My Lin could feel it in the way people paused on the packed-down road outside her cabin, how whispers floated just a breath too loud to be mistaken for the wind. They say the Chinese woman is nursing a white baby, not just nursing. Raising him, like he's her own. She's lost her mind. It ain't natural. The words drifted like smoke through town, staining everything they touched. That afternoon, the crunch of heavy boots on snow broke the still air. My Lin was inside, rocking when a harsh voice called her name. My Lin! Come out here right now. She stepped onto the porch, the baby nestled in her arms, one tiny mouth rooting gently against her shoulder. 6 men stood in her yard. At the front was Bartholomew Thorne, owner of the general store, his fists clenched and his face reddened with rage. Behind him were other men she recognized from town, their rifles held loosely but ready. You are betraying your kind, Thorne growled, his voice thick with fury. And ours. Sheltering that man's child. Don't you understand your place here? He is a child, My Lin said, her voice calm despite the tremor inside her. And he is hungry. She walked down the steps, her cloth-soled boots sinking into the fresh snow, and stood directly in front of the group. The baby stirred, stretching a tiny hand. Without hesitation, My Lin adjusted her shawl, shifted in her arms, and brought him to her breast. Gasps rippled through the men. Their faces twisted with a mixture of shock and disgust. My Lin lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. This child is not your enemy, she said, her voice clear and strong. But your hate sounds like mine. No one spoke. The air thickened, silent and heavy. Then, slow, measured footsteps approached from the road. Agnes Miller, the stoic and respected widow of the town's first doctor, walked into view. She carried a small, covered pot. She did not speak as she crossed the yard. She passed the circle of men, ignoring their glares, and set the pot gently on the front step. Beef stew, she said quietly. With barley. For the mother she looked at My Lin, then at and feed him. That is what mothers do. Then she turned and walked back down the road, her head held high. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow-laden sky. Thorne spat into the snow. This is not over, he muttered, then turned and stormed off. The other men followed, leaving only the pot and My Lin's defiance behind. She stood there long after they'd gone, and still nursing, his small fingers curled into her shawl. The pot of stew sent a warm plume of steam into the frigid air. That night, when Jackson returned, she served him a bowl without a word. He sat by the flickering lamp, his eyes steady and guarded. The cabin smelled of broth and barley. When he finished, he set his bowl aside. "They came?" he asked. "They left," she said. His gaze drifted to the cradle. "And the woman?" A stew and a few kind words. My Lin smiled, wearied but resolute. Jackson nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. Kindness is a rare thing in a hard winter. He placed his hand over hers. His fingers closed around it, warm and surprisingly gentle. The fire popped softly behind them, embers dancing in the dark. And beyond those walls, Coyote Creek was still watching, its judgment lingering like a restless ghost. But inside, a mother, a child, and a man sat together, bound by the quiet courage to choose warmth over the cold. They came just after dusk, when the last of the light bled from the sky and the wind picked up again. My Lin knew before she heard them. She felt it in the way and stirred in his cradle, whimpering not from hunger but from a deeper unease. Jackson was by the fire, sharpening a blade. He paused, lifted his head, and listened. "Boots," he said. More than a few, then came the pounding on the door. "My Lin, you've got one chance. Open up." My Lin stood, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. Jackson was already at the door, tall and silent. "No," she whispered, placing a hand on his arm. "Let me." He stepped aside. She unlatched the door and pulled it open. Bartholomew Thorne stood there, flanked by 6 men, their faces twisted in the lantern light. "I warned you," Thorne said, his eyes darting between My Lin and Jackson. "Hand over the boy. He belongs with his own kind." My Lin did not move. Jackson stepped into the doorway beside her. He wore no weapon on his belt, but his presence alone was like steel. "You do not belong here," Thorne spat at Jackson. "And she has no claim on that child." Jackson looked at him and said nothing. That calm, absolute silence was more unsettling than 100 shouted threats. One of Thorne's men, a burly fellow named Finch, sneered. "Say something, Croft. Or are you going to hide behind a foreign woman?" Still, Jackson did not speak. He took one step forward, until he was standing between My Lin and the men. Finch moved too fast. He lunged, maybe to grab the child, maybe to push past Jackson. But before his hand reached the doorway, Jackson caught him by the wrist. With a single, fluid motion, he twisted it down with enough force to drop Finch to his knees in the snow. The man's rifle clattered to the ground. The others tensed but did not move, not with Jackson's unwavering gaze on them. "You do not own this child," Jackson said, his voice low but carrying like thunder in the still night. He looked at My Lin, then back at Thorne. "She is his mother. And I am his father." My Lin's breath caught. The fire crackled behind them. No one moved. Thorne took a step forward, then thought better of it. "You'll regret this," he hissed. My Lin stood taller. "You are not the law here, Mr. Thorne. And neither is your fear." Thorne stared at her, then at Jackson, then turned. "Let's go." One by one, the men followed. When they were gone, My Lin shut the door slowly, then leaned against it. Jackson picked up the fallen rifle and set it gently against the wall. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said simply. My Lin looked at him, the man who had not drawn a weapon, not shouted, only stood his ground. "What you said?" she whispered. "Was it true?" Jackson's eyes softened. "Which part?" "That I am his mother's." He walked to the cradle. And stirred, then slept again. "You fed him. You held him. You stayed," Jackson said. "No blood makes you more his mother than that, and you?" she asked. "I was ready to die for him," he answered. "So yes, I am his father." They stood there, the 3 of them. A woman who once grieved alone. A man who thought his story had ended. And a child born into the cold and cradled in the arms of those who chose love. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the air held steady. And Jackson Croft placed his hand gently on My Lin's shoulder, as if to say, "We do not run from the storm. We stand in it together." The moon rose high, silvering the snow-covered hills. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. My Lin stood on a small stool beneath the heavy beam that stretched across the ceiling. In her hand was the carving knife Jackson had sharpened. She gripped it tightly, her other hand guiding the tip to the wood. Character by character, she carved. She whispered the name aloud, and, carving it deep into the grain of the beam, above the cradle where he now slept. "There," she murmured. "Now the walls will remember, too." Behind her, Jackson shifted in the chair. His face was pale. Blood soaked the cloth wrapped around his thigh, where he had slipped on the ice while tracking a buck and gashed his leg on a sharp rock. He had carried the meat back regardless. My Lin turned and crossed to him. She knelt, untied the blooded bandage, and dipped a clean rag into the bowl of boiled water beside them. She worked slowly, her hand steady. "You should have waited," she said, dabbing the wound. "The meat was needed," he replied. She gave a soft, exasperated sigh. Stubborn man. She finished cleaning the wound and began to wrap it with fresh cloth. Her fingers lingered over his skin. "Jackson," she said softly. He looked down at her, his eyes dark in the firelight. "I am not afraid," she whispered. Not anymore. Something shifted in him. His hand rose, calloused and strong, and he laid it over hers. "You gave my son a name," he said, his voice rough with something deeper than pain. "You gave us both a home." My Lin swallowed the ache rising in her throat. "Jackson," she began, but he was already reaching for something in his pocket. He placed it in her hand. It was a simple silver ring, unadorned but solid and true. "For you," he said. "So the world will know you are part of us now." My Lin stared at the ring. "What does this mean?" "It means I am asking you to stay," Jackson said. "Not just for the boy. For me. For us." She closed her fingers around it, pressing it to her chest. "You are not just feeding my child," he continued. "You are planting something that will live longer than either of us." My Lin's eyes filled with tears. "Then I will wear it proudly." She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches of the pines. And stirred in his sleep, then settled again. Jackson leaned back in the chair, his breathing slowing. My Lin curled on the floor beside him, her head resting lightly against his knee. "We'll plant in the spring," she murmured. "Corn, beans, squash. And a small garden of herbs, like my mother grew." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "And will grow strong with them." She smiled. "I carved his name into the beam tonight," she said. "So this house will remember." Jackson closed his eyes. "It already does." They sat in silence as moonlight slipped through the window. Tomorrow the world might knock on their door again with its judgment. But tonight, there was only warmth and the name carved into the wood above them, and the knowledge that a new family had been born, not from blood, but from courage. The sun had nearly set when Agnes Miller's warning came, delivered by her young son. "They are coming tonight. Thorn won't wait for the law." My Lin's heart pounded as she hurriedly packed a knapsack. Jackson wrapped a sturdy leather sling around the baby's cradle. Moonlight streamed through their cabin's doorway as they slipped out, My Lin clutching and close. They moved silently toward the timberline, feet sinking into the deep snow. The forest loomed, a cathedral of shadowed trunks. Jackson led them deeper, the ancient trees muffling their passage. They reached the creek, a ribbon of black water flowing between banks of ice. Jackson paused, then motioned for My Lin to follow a steep path upward. But just beyond the creek, moonlight glinted off a rifle barrel. Dozens of shapes materialized from the shadows. Thorn and his men. They had drawn a trap. Jackson pressed My Lin back against a snow-covered boulder, rifle raised. "Stay," he whispered. "Protect him." Thorn stepped forward, a sneer in his lantern light. Nowhere left to run. Jackson's knuckles whitened around the rifle stock. My Lin clenched and closed her eyes, her heartbeat drumming. She thought of the silver ring, the name carved overhead, the life they were building. Then a shot rang out, not from Thorn's side, but from behind them. A torch flared. A tall figure emerged onto the path. Reverend Gideon, followed by a man wearing a federal badge. "Sheriff Warren," he said briskly. "U.S. Marshal." Reverend Gideon stepped forward, his voice ringing in the cold air. "Back off, Bartholomew." "This family is protected." Thorn squinted, shock and fury twisting his features. "This is town business. This child and his mother and his father are under federal protection," the marshal replied, his voice like iron. "One step further, and you take on the United States." A murmur ran through the men. Thorn spat on the ground. "We'll remember this." The marshal raised his hand. "Leave now. And consider this your only warning." With a final glare, Thorn motioned to his men, and they retreated into the darkness. The moonlight returned fully, and the forest sighed. Reverend Gideon approached. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Jackson knelt, examining a long tear in his trousers where a bullet had grazed his thigh. A full year had passed. Seasons turned over the hills of Coyote Creek, and the cabin had grown. A garden bloomed in the summer and lay sleeping under the winter snow, but its roots were deep. Laughter echoed from the porch. My Lin had turned the old smokehouse into a one-room school, teaching a half-dozen children, settler and rancher alike. Inside the home, Jackson carved wood day after day. The crib he built for Anne was sturdy and beautiful. On its side, he etched symbols: a soaring bird, a steadfast mountain, a winding river. On a quiet Sunday morning, he placed it beside their bed, his dark eyes glinting with pride. That evening, as the first stars pierced the sky, Jackson brought My Lin to the fire circle behind their home. Strings of paper lanterns swayed from the trees. Nathaniel sat on Agnes Miller's lap, playing with a ribbon. Jackson knelt beside her. "My Lin," he said softly. "Will you live with me, not as mine, but as my equal?" My Lin's breath caught. She knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and pulled him close. "I am already home." Their ceremony was simple. Reverend Gideon stood not as a minister, but as a witness. My Lin wore a dress of deep blue, and a red silk sash was woven around her waist. They stood beneath a hand-built arch of pine and winterberry. No vows were needed. Only their hands joined in the firelight. When the final lantern was lit, Jackson led My Lin inside. There, he reached for the thick crossbeam above their hearth. With his carving knife, he etched two names beside the Chinese character for Anne Jackson. My Lin. Then, stepping back, he looked at her. "This is our home now." My Lin touched the names, feeling the grooves beneath her fingers. So simple, so permanent. A record not just of people, but of belonging. Under the endless Wyoming sky, two hearts, once broken, had chosen not just to survive, but to build a life together.